The agenda this week explored new vaccine technology aimed at keeping COVID-19 in check and remembered the first Black politician elected to a legislature in Canada, Ontario's Leonard Braithwaite. The agenda's week in review begins with the war in Ukraine and assessing the role of cyber attacks in the conflict.
A headline in Politico said, "A Russian invasion of Ukraine could redefine cyber warfare." Former White House cyber expert Jason Healy said that it will be the first time a state with real capabilities is willing to take risks and put it all on the line. A report from the RAND Corporation warned of the, quote, massive employment of cyber warfare tools to create shock and awe, causing Ukraine's defenses or will to fight to collapse. Let's explore that. Jacqueline, to what extent have any of those things happened?
So none of those things have happened. And I think if you look back at the work that Brandon Valeriano and I and many other scholars within academia have been doing, we actually didn't anticipate that cyber would look like a bomb or that cyber would decrease the will of the Ukrainians to fight. In fact, a lot of the academic research conducted over the last 3 to 5 years suggested that the cyber war would play out exactly how it has played out so far.
Brandon, are we learning that cyber operations actually, apparently, are not all that useful when it comes to the battlefield?
Well, yeah, that's something we've thought for quite a bit of time, that they're not really coercive, they're not really useful on the battlefield, that this idea of decisive victory through cyber never really was true, logically, empirically, historically.
Christian, why do you think? Tell us your view on why you think things have been so quiet on the cyber front.
Yeah, well, it's either the dog that didn't bark or the dog that hasn't barked yet. And so I think there may be also an issue of perhaps the Russians sort of keeping their powder dry. It may be that perhaps we're better prepared than we thought we were. It may be that the Russians just simply aren't as capable as we thought. We may be doing a very good job at suppressing certain of their capabilities. So, for instance, there appears to have been some impact on ransomware by some of these state-tolerated dark actors in Russia. So it seems that there is a significant amount of activity. And so I think it's difficult to tell from the open source evidence how much of this is attributable to what particular types of causes. But I do think perhaps the Russian operatives were caught as unprepared as their kinetic counterparts in having to operationalize a cyber campaign. And so they just perhaps didn't just have the time to actually pre-position themselves and shift from espionage capabilities to subversion or sabotage capabilities at the scale at which would have been necessary on this very short timeline.
Jacqueline, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, if you don't mind, if I could throw in a little bit of a caveat, because while we didn't see cyber operations looking like a bomb or looking like an aircraft, I think we are seeing cyber operations play out in an important way on the battlefield. There are reports of hacking into satellite networks that may potentially have had a large impact on Ukrainian abilities to command and control their forces at the beginning of this conflict. And I think as this conflict goes on, we're going to get a better understanding of how the Russians have tried to use cyber more like an intelligence tool or as a sabotage tool to try and create fog, to try and create uncertainty and decrease the ability to command and control. And I think when we look back in the future at puzzles around this conflict and why the Russians have had such a difficulty controlling and commanding their own forces, why they seem to be always talking on unclassified networks, I think we're going to find that there is a much larger role for cyber operations, but it's going to look a lot more like intelligence and a lot less like bombs. And I think that's the overarching lesson that states should take from this conflict.
Janice, as Angela has said, Russia thought this war was going to be over pretty quickly, and it's pretty obvious it's not going to be over pretty quickly. Was there, as you look back at the past month, was there an apparent turning point in which everybody came to realize, oh my goodness, this is not going to take 72 hours, this is going to take a lot longer?
I think there certainly was, and it was probably the easiest way to convey that was that infamous convoy that rolled down the highways toward Kiev, and then it was stalled and stalled and stalled. There's an old military expression, Steve: logistics eat strategy every day for lunch. And that is a big part of what is bedeviling the Russians. Their logistics are terrible, is the only way to describe this. But when we talk about a stalemate, which I think is accurate, but only up to a point, let's just remember there is asymmetrical damage being inflicted here. Yes, Russians are losing soldiers, anywhere up to 7,000, which is, just an unbelievably high number for a month. It's important to recognize this. But Ukrainian cities are being devastated. It's not only Mariupol, it's many of them. And Russia retains the capacity to bomb and to use cruise missiles and to use artillery fire. That does not take away from how bravely the Ukrainians are fighting, but we have to be careful. There is a limited capacity. Any society has that, to sustain this kind of horrific damage on its civilian infrastructure. So stalemate doesn't quite capture these asymmetrical dynamics.
Understood. Angela, it seemed clear that the original attempt by Vladimir Putin was to have regime change in Kiev and essentially demilitarize Ukraine. Neither of those things has happened yet. Do you think that's still the plan for Russia?
Before I get into that, let me just say the Russian population supports this war because they don't really know what's going on, particularly if they just have access to state-run media. They're told that this is a special military operation to denazify Ukraine and that Ukraine and NATO were threatening Russia with invasion. If they knew more about what was really happening, I'm not quite sure that the support would be that great. And just to reiterate again, a lot of the body bags are not coming back because they're not sending them back to Russia. They're keeping them in Belarus, and there are reports of that, about that today. So I think on the regime change, Putin has more or less given up on that. I think they've realized that, Zelensky is popular, that if they do want to negotiate with anyone, and maybe we'll come onto that later, Zelensky is the person they're going to have to negotiate with. Apparently, in the beginning, they did try to put someone else in power, and then they realized it was impossible, and that if they were to have a puppet government, they would have to occupy Ukraine going forward, because the minute Russian troops withdraw, then that puppet government would fall. And my colleagues who are experts on these military matters say it would take about 800,000 Russian troops to occupy Ukraine, for a long time, and they just don't have the resources to do that. The demilitarization, I think they also realize, is going to be more difficult. I mean, they have knocked out quite a lot of Ukraine's own military equipment, and obviously Ukrainian soldiers have died too. But because the West is supplying Ukraine and will continue to do so, it would be difficult to do that. So their aims, I think, have become somewhat more realistic as this war has gone on. But it's still Putin's goal to subjugate Ukraine if he could. And obviously, Russia does have superior military power to the Ukrainians, undoubtedly. And it's also by now more or less cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea. It's really, in effect now, Ukraine is a landlocked country as it stands at the moment. So, of course, the Russians could, in the long run, prevail, but then at what cost, both domestically in Russia and in terms of, future sanctions.
Janice, I do want to pick up on that asymmetrical warfare that you just talked about a moment ago. And to that end, I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, whom you know, to bring up a map of Ukraine right now so we can essentially, for those watching on television, can see the state of play. And for those who are listening on podcast right now, let me just point out Mariupol, which you have heard so much about in recent days in the southeastern part of the country, surrounded by Russian forces. President Zelensky has said it has been reduced to ashes. Janice, I wonder if you could tell us what you think if the Russians were able to completely capture that city, never mind destroy it, but capture and hold it, what that would mean in terms of their war effort.
Well, the reason they have inflicted so much damage on Mariupol, Steve, is because, as you saw on the map, a key goal for Putin is a land bridge for Crimea.
A booster dose implies that you've got your vaccine series, you're done, and then this is, increasing your protection a little bit. And I think that really speaks to people maybe who feel more vulnerable and feel that this is something optional that you do if you maybe think you need a bit more protection. And that's, I think, not the case anymore. With the Omicron variant, you really do need 3 doses to get reasonably good protection against COVID-19. And I think we should really be reframing that fully vaccinated now means actually 3 doses, and that this is a 3-dose vaccine series. And I think that framing might help really get people in the mindset that they haven't finished getting vaccinated, they're not fully vaccinated as the language goes with 2 doses, but they actually need to get the 3 doses.
And Omar, just to build on what Dr. Hirji was just saying, we've had various variants since the vaccines came out. Are the vaccines we are now using still effective against the new mutated variants?
For the original vaccines, they did a great job at fighting off the virus that they were originally designed for. But with high case numbers, there was viral evolution because every replication event is an opportunity for a mutation. And the problem is that the antibodies that we were developing weren't as good at recognizing these mutated spike proteins, which is fine, that happens. But so the ability to recognize it went down a bit. So you do have good protection, you have long-lasting protection. It's just now you're asking your antibodies to see and recognize something that looks a bit different. So in framing it like that, when we boost people, we can bring back up your antibody levels to a high enough level where even if they are slightly less effective, there's more of them. So you can kind of help compensate for that. And that's what we call recall. So we try to induce recall. And otherwise, if you have antibodies that just don't have a good shot at recognizing the new mutated versions, then your immune system would likely try to restart that process and develop brand new antibodies for it instead of using the original ones that are potentially less effective. So this is part of the challenge. And having a booster is a great stopgap while we wait for more updated vaccines to kind of tide us over.
And Matthew, I guess this is where the conversation could lead to what's been done right now, this idea of redesigning the vaccines that we already have. Why might they be more effective if they were to be redesigned?
Well, the situation we're in right now, in many ways, is analogous to the situation that we're used to annually with seasonal influenza. As my colleague just described, over the course of the past 2 years since the pandemic started, the very high global case rates have allowed this virus to evolve and mutate in such a way that it's no longer recognized as well by the immune responses we generated via vaccination. And so one way to improve the quality of that immune response is to update our current vaccines so that they're a closer match to the viruses that are actually causing infections now.
And Don, how would that work? Would we have to go from starting from scratch, or do we need to do full clinical trials as well?
It's a great question. We've learned a lot about protective immune responses to this virus. And so some of that learning we've been able to implement to next generation vaccines. And in fact, my very clever colleague, Matthew, has done some of that work in redesigning an inhaled vaccine that triggers different parts of the immune system, the cellular response as opposed to the antibody response. So in many ways, we have a little bit more knowledge about features that are more resistant to the virus changing and mutating. And by harnessing immune responses to those conserved elements, we may get more or better cross-variant protection. As for whether we need full clinical trials, well, that really depends on whether we understand what we call the immune correlate of protection is. So if we could say your antibodies have to be here to be protected, or you need so many T cells, then we could use that as a proxy measure instead of waiting for people to get naturally infected. Clinical trials take a lot longer if there's less infection circulating and we have to wait for people to be infected. So understanding these immune correlates of protection gives us a stopgap that we can make some inferences about protection without waiting for a really long period of time for people to get naturally infected in the trials.
Let's start with a little background, since as we suggested off the top, I suspect a lot of people have never heard of Len Braithwaite. So here we go, the graphic, please, Sheldon. Leonard Braithwaite was born in Toronto in 1923 to a Barbadian father and Jamaican mother. He served overseas with the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II. He had a BCom from the University of Toronto in 1950, an MBA from Harvard Business School in 52, his law degree at Osgoode Hall in 58, got elected 2 years later to be a school board trustee, then a town councillor from Etobicoke in 1962, became the MPP for Etobicoke from 63 to 75, and then made a political comeback as controller back in municipal government for the city of Etobicoke from 82 to 85. Now, Michael Coteau, I'm going to start with you first because, frankly, you're the guy who called me a few weeks back and said, here's a guy no one's heard of, and we ought to do a show on this. So you get the first question here, and I'm going to take you back to 2011, when you were one of 12 people of color elected to the Ontario legislature, 12 out of 107. And I wonder what you imagine it would have been like for Len Braithwaite to walk into that legislature in 1963, not 12, but one out of 108. What do you think?
You know, when I used to walk the hallways of Queen's Park and you see these big murals of all these politicians and you see their pictures, and, you know, Mr. Braithwaite always stood out for obvious reasons. There was himself and a woman by the name of Pritchard. She was the only woman, he was the only person of color. And I used to just stop every time I walked by those pictures and looked at his face and thought the same thing, you know, what was life like for him? And I couldn't tell you, you know, because I didn't know him very well, what his life may have been like, but I could imagine. But I always knew walking by there that I had a lot to thank him for really not only breaking the barriers of politics in Ontario, but being the first Black Canadian in this entire country that really just made it possible for someone like me to be elected. And, you know, I'm very grateful for him. And in 2012, I gave a tribute to him in the Ontario legislature. And since that point forward, I've just been researching his life more and more and really just recognizing his importance in Canadian politics.
Just to be clear, you are drawing a line between his own election in 1963 and your election half a century later. You think you can make that direct connection?
Well, think about it. After him, who was the next person elected, who was Black in Ontario? It was, I think in 85, it was Alvin Curling.
And 20 years later.
20 years later. And Alvin Curling is the guy I go to for advice because there's not many people, you know, who are, you know, Caribbean background, African Canadian that have walked that pathway. So, you know, Alvin talks about Mr. Braithwaite a lot, and I feel like I have a connection to him, even though it was way back in the early 60s and I was elected in 2011.
Okay, Gwyn, I gather he was a mentor of yours back in the day. Maybe you could tell us how that happened.
Well, I've always been very interested in service. I grew up in St. Lucia with a father who told us that we have to be our brother's keepers. So, you know, we took that very, very seriously. And at the time, I was looking for people who I feel could inspire the next generation of leaders. And, you know, I was at the time putting on a lot of sessions within the city, schools, churches, City Hall, and Queen's Park. And we were looking for our legends, our icons who've carried us, you know, to this time. We wanted to make sure that we acknowledge them and that we got all the lessons that we could from them. And so we, you know, at the time I met Leonard Braithwaite, Lincoln Alexander, the great Dr. Howard McCurdy, who was an incredible mentor of mine as well. And, you know, what I felt my responsibility was to take these people's lives and put them forward so that others can be inspired, they could learn from it and understand the value of civic engagement, of political involvement, of voting. And so this is how I came across this wonderful man.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.